Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Blue Mountain Politics. I'm your host, Hunter White. Today we're going to get started with the 2024 presidential election. What I want to do with today's video is I want us to sort of explore what it would look like should President Biden have a rebound in economic numbers or in polling numbers. What would a best case scenario look like for Democrats? We're going to jump right into this. Let's start with a state like Washington. Now, of course, Washington's always going to stay Democratic, so we can put that in the safe Democratic column. I characterize states that have an over 10% margin of victory as a Democratic vote. Now, a lot of people may say, well, Hunter, that seems awful low, but to tell you the truth, I'm not a math guy, and any number like 12 or 15%, to tell you the truth, I won't be able to figure that out in my head. So I'm just going to keep it at 10%. That'll go as well with a state like Oregon. I mean, you're obviously going to see, even though they got pretty close, the Republicans got fairly close with the governor's election in 2022, you're not going to see that same sort of performance again. That was a relatively moderate Republican who was in a three-way race, and she still fell behind by, I believe, about 2 to 3 points behind her Democratic opponent. You're not going to see that same replication of Republican turnout in 2024, as well as the fact that most independents and all Democrats, rather than splitting between the independent and the Democratic candidates in the governor's election, are going to coalesce around President Biden. So you're not going to see a Trump win in this state. Going down to California, I mean, this is very obvious. As long as San Francisco, San Diego, and Los Angeles have a monopoly over California politics, it's very unlikely that the Republicans will be able to get within 10 points in this state. Furthering on to Hawaii, very similar to California. As long as these bigger parts of the island, cities like Honolulu, as well as places like Maui, you're still going to have a pretty serious Democratic win. Even in the rural areas, considering that this is a state that's very socially liberal, as well as newly admitted to the Union, you're going to continue to see Democratic turnout really high in this state. When I say new to the Union, I mean relatively new. We do see that there's a bit of difference with Alaska, but we'll get to Alaska in a bit. But Hawaii, we can characterize as safely Democratic. We're going to move sort of eastward from the West Coast. Let's start off with Nevada. Now, this is a best case scenario, ladies and gentlemen. Please keep that in mind in the comments. Nevada could very possibly be won by President Biden by 10 points. Do I personally believe it's going to happen? Absolutely not. But it is possible. How would he do that is sort of the big question. Well, when you have turnout way up in places like Las Vegas and in Reno, you're going to just be able to completely outvote the rest of the Republican areas, even if suburbs are voting for Republicans. And keep this in mind, when I say, best case scenario, I really do mean it. This is a case where President Trump is either incarcerated or he's replaced late on, or there's some sort of major scandal, or the president just does there's some sort of remarkable godsend of a turnaround for him. Moving on, we're going to move to Colorado. Now, Colorado has been trending Democratic much, much more recently, since 2004. We're going to see continuous margins, except for 2016, where Democrats are winning by double digits. It's entirely possible, even in just what I believe will be the actual election, which I'll make a prediction on that later on, that I believe that still, places like Denver and Colorado Springs are still going to completely overtake any other parts of the state. Excuse the interruption. We're moving on to New Mexico. New Mexico, once again, with places like Santa Fe and Albuquerque, you're going to see a 10-point Democratic win. We can move on now to sort of this area of the country, sort of what we like to call the Midwest, if you're from outside of the United States. Let's start with Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District. When you have a place like Omaha here that traditionally has voted either moderately towards the Republicans or has voted moderately towards Democrats, in a best case scenario, President Biden can absolutely win this district by 10 points. Moving on, Minnesota easily can be won by 10 points. It might even be feasible to win it by 6 or 7 points, given President Biden's current polling. I think that's pretty unlikely, but we will see it to be a little bit more contested than it was last time. But we'll still see a pretty serious Biden win. Absolute best case scenario for Democrats, just given the fact that Minneapolis, as well as Union and Steel Country, are just going to be pulling out for the Democrats. Moving on to Wisconsin, I don't really feel good about characterizing Wisconsin or Michigan yet, so we'll get there eventually. Let's look at Illinois. Illinois was always going to vote Democratic overwhelmingly anyways, just because of that Chicago suburb, so we don't really have a lot else to talk about here. Moving on to the Northeast, places like Vermont, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and D.C. are all very obviously going to continue to vote seriously Democratic, given the the climate that's up there. We haven't really seen serious Republican wins, with the exception of very moderate and very liberal Republicans. And Mr. Trump is not going to be able to pull that off. Best case scenario, of course, this is even without a best case scenario, but Maine's 1st district will go to President Biden. Best case scenario, too, he can also win Maine at large. Maine's 2nd district is going to be a much more difficult thing to talk about, but we'll get there when we get there. Next, we have Virginia. Virginia is sort of a weird case, and I feel sort of odd about characterizing it one way or the other, especially considering that I have not put Michigan in the Democrat plus 10 column. So I don't really feel comfortable putting Virginia there either, which might come as a surprise to some people, but for now, we're going to characterize it as not safe Democratic quite yet. Let's move on to safe Republican, though. Of course, you're going to have your classic plain states, so that includes the Dakotas, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, as well as most of Nebraska. We can probably talk about Kansas later on here, but let's talk Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. These are all going to be safe Republican states regardless. Kansas is sort of a hard one. I don't necessarily think the Democrats have any chance of winning here. This is more of just what are the margins going to be. I think in a best case scenario for Democrats, it is feasible for the Democrats to get within 8 points of the Republicans. I think it's very, very unlikely. So honestly, I'll probably still characterize it as safe red. Same goes with South Carolina and Indiana. Missouri is another one, sort of like Kansas, where it's technically possible that they could get within, 7 to 8 points if the Democratic turnout's really good, Republican turnout's really bad. But I'm still going to keep it safe red for now. Let's move on to likely blue states. So likely blue is anything within 5 to 10 points. These are going to basically be your classic actors. So a place like New Hampshire, very, very likely going to be going to the Democrats, even without a best case scenario. But I can see New Hampshire being won by maybe around 8 to 9 points by the Biden campaign in a best case scenario. Same goes with a state like Virginia and Michigan. With Virginia, if you have Nova as well as sort of the Norfolk, Hampton Roads area, which is sort of nearby where I am, you'll see, pretty serious Democratic turnout here regardless. I still think Biden's probably going to win this state by about 6 points. But at the end of the day, I think, a 9 to 10 point, it's possible it could be safe in a best case scenario. But at the end of the day, just given Youngkin's win recently and how contested the off-year elections were with the state legislature, I'm going to keep it here for now. Moving on to Michigan. Michigan, to me, is pretty clearly a toss-up just in the general election. However, don't underestimate the union voters. I think if you see a pretty serious economic uptick within the next, 6 to 8 months, I think you're going to see a lot of union voters continue to vote for Biden, especially considering the presence of, Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor. It's very possible that Biden could win this state. Best case scenario, I'm thinking he'll win it by 8 to 9 points. In the actual general election prediction, you guys will see that next video, what my actual prediction is for that. But we're just sticking with best case scenario right now. Moving on, we're going to move to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, it's definitely not going to be like an 8-point win like I think it would be in Michigan or Virginia or New Hampshire. But I'm thinking, 5.5 to 6 points is probably going to be, gosh, if I can get it right here, it's probably going to be about right for Pennsylvania. If you get enough of the union voters as well as high enough turnout in places like Pittsburgh and, Philadelphia, goodness, I couldn't remember the name of the city for a second, you're going to see a pretty good Democratic turnout there. I think that's pretty fair so far, a pretty fair characterization of what Democrats can expect when it comes to likely states. Let's move to Republicans. Of course, Montana is going to be a likely state. Even though you're having a lot more people moving into Helena and Billings, it's not enough to outset the fact that there's a huge population of people in this country, or not in this country, in this state, who are very conservative and who are focused on, whether the ranch lifestyle or some very small suburbs in this state. But what you're going to see is predominantly a Republican win. Best case scenario for Biden, Trump still wins this place by, I'd say, a minimum 8 points. Same goes for a place like Alaska. We'll move to Texas in a second. Alaska's probably going to go, best case scenario for Biden, still going to go to Trump by about 9 points. Even if, sort of the down ballot races somehow, it's sort of like a reverse, like even if they somehow boost Biden, I still think that you're going to see Alaska go by a pretty good margin here. I don't think Biden really has an actual chance to win this, but it's just, once again, it comes down to the margins. Same goes with Iowa, and we'll talk about Ohio, but Iowa first. Iowa's ever since the loss of sort of the blue collar voter by Democrats. The loss of the farm voter, it's going to be really difficult for Democrats to win here. Especially a person like President Biden. You're not going to see a pretty serious win here, I think, for Democrats for quite some time. It'll be a really long time before another Democrat comes along to try to win over blue-collar voters who felt really disenfranchised by the Democratic Party, but who feel that the economic protectionism that was established by President Trump and carried over by President Biden, but President Biden doesn't really get a very good, he doesn't really get gold stars for messaging in this country. So I would say Iowa probably going to Trump by 7 to 8 points. Let's talk Texas. We'll get to Ohio in a second. Texas is, best case scenario for Biden. He's going to see maybe 5.5 points here. But even still, I think it's very unlikely that he is going to come out with a win in this state. Even though the demographics are shifting, I think when you have a nominee like Biden, even in the best case scenario, you're going to have a pretty rough time in winning in Texas as a Democrat. It does pain me to say it too, but I think it's going to take a really special kind of nominee and perhaps a running mate from Texas to be able to get this state really back in the Democratic column like it was, sort of back before the 1970s. It's going to be really hard to do it. Moving on, I think Ohio is sort of a similar story to Iowa. I think it can just be a little bit closer because you can really run up the margins in big cities like Cleveland and Columbus. But I think at the end of the day, I'm putting it in the likely column, but I mean, that's because I'm anticipating maybe a 5.5 to 6 point win in Biden's best case scenario. So once again, going to be really hard for Democrats to win in either of these states. We'll go over it more in the actual predictions video, but best case scenario, he's going to have a hard time winning in any of these states. All right, let's move on to lean Democratic. Lean Democratic, you can kind of tell what we're looking at here, which is that, a place like Arizona, which is actually originally where I'm from, you're going to see if a county like Maricopa, which is where Phoenix is, and a lot of those major cities, as well as down in Tucson, if you see a pretty big run-up in those margins as well as out in sort of the Native American reservations, you're going to see a pretty serious, Democratic turnout. And as it is right now, I have another prediction for Arizona. But as I said, best case scenario, Biden can win this state by probably about 4 points. If he really gave it a shot, I think 52 to 48 would be feasible. It's even possible it could go lean, or not, it could go likely, I should say. But I'm going to put it in lean for now. Same goes with Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin, once again, it's one of those states that it could be characterized as likely, but for the sake of this prediction, I think it's probably best to just put it as lean for now, given the fact that, Ron Johnson won there in their Senate race, and, there was some pretty big hubbub about the fact that they had a Supreme Court win for the Democrats in that state for their Supreme Court race, but I think given the presence of a lot of rural voters, even if Milwaukee and Madison are both turning out pretty high, once again, I'm still seeing maximum, he could get up to like a 6 point win if I can get this back in the right color like this, but I'm going to go with about a 5 point win here. Let's talk about Maine's 2nd district. It's going to be really hard for him to win here, but it is entirely possible that, if he does really, really well, I could see him winning this maybe by a point or two. But I think he's going to have a very, very hard time in Maine's 2nd district, as we'll see in the later prediction. Let's talk about Georgia. Georgia, once again, a lot like Maine's 2nd. It's going to be hard for him to pull out another win here. But if he has the same voter turnout that he had last time, I do think it's entirely possible that he does run up the margin and he maybe gets a 2 to 3 point win here. Best case scenario. I think it's pretty unlikely, but we can stick with that for now. Republican lean, Florida's very obvious. A lot of people might be surprised by that. As I said, this is the best case scenario. So I think it's pretty unlikely for Biden to win that state, but it's feasible. But he would have to put in pardon my language, a shitload of work in that state. There would have to be a lot of things that he would need to do right. And I think it would be very hard for him to win, but I can see him, getting within 1 to 2 points max. All right, our final tilt state is just going to be North Carolina. North Carolina I see as sort of a bellwether in this election, which is that I think it'll be close enough even without the best case scenario, which I will do a best case scenario for President Trump as well. But for President Biden, best case scenario, I do see him winning North Carolina by a pretty slim margin. I'd say just under a point, but I don't see it as likely, generally speaking. But I think that, if he really runs up the numbers in Charlotte and in Raleigh, as well as along the coast, it's entirely possible, that you're going to see a win here. So let's talk about why I got to this prediction. So, of course, I think partially it's because I don't think a lot of people give the president, not necessarily the president himself, but President Biden's team enough credit in running good campaigns. They ran a pretty good operation last time around. They had some pretty serious bumbles, and it was very hard to sort of lose against a guy like Trump last time around, and they're going to have a harder time this time because voters have pretty short-term memory, as I think we all do, They're going to have a harder time sort of grappling with things like COVID, as well as, when you look at the former president's rhetoric, I think that'll sort of play in with a lot of voters. But at the end of the day, it's going to be difficult for Democrats to win this election. But I did want to see sort of what it would look like if you are able to win over that coalition again, A place like Michigan, not only are you relying on union voters, but you're also relying on African-American voters, you're relying on suburban voters, and you're relying on an Arab American population there as well, which will, is less likely to turn out given the Gaza situation. Mr. Biden really needs to make some serious amends with voters in that state. When it comes to Arizona, you really need to run up Hispanics. You need to show that you're doing enough economically and when it comes to immigration to justify Hispanic support. And it's the same story with places like Georgia and North Carolina, as well as Pennsylvania and Virginia, which is that, if the president doesn't show that he's really performing well with African Americans, that he's giving them more economic opportunities, then you're going to see a really hard time for the president. He's going to have some difficulty here. And of course, Democrats have pretty long ignored the white working class for at least the last 10 years. And as long as that's the case, good luck winning any of these big states, Florida, Texas, Montana, Iowa, or Ohio. You're not going to win those. And, it would be barely just scratching by a win out here in Maine's 2nd Congressional District. Even that, I don't even know if that's feasible. But this is really, the likelihood of this happening is next to zero. You're not going to see a very significant portion of voters who are looking to reelect the president, and you're going to see a lot of them who are looking pretty rapidly to unseat him. So the Democrats are really going to need to turn things around here for there to be a win. But I'm going to go over in my next video sort of what I think will actually happen. And after that, I'm going to go over what I think a Trump best case scenario will look like. So I really appreciate you guys tuning in. This is my first video. It's completely unscripted, so I'm sure that I made some errors. Hopefully going to get a little better as time goes along. This is my first stint with YouTube, so if I made any errors, please feel free to let me know politely in the comments. Really interested to see what you all think. So thank you very much for watching. Appreciate you. Hit the subscribe button if you want to for more content on elections, and I'll see you next time. Thank you so much.